The 1D&D sorcerer, sits in this strange place where it's almost hard to justify its existence, but is interesting enough that I want to see what can be done with it. Much like with the revised Warlock, the team has said that it was their intention to try and deliver much more of a mechanical identity than was present in the 2014 version of the class, and also much like the Warlock, I'm not really sure how well they succeeded on that. So join me for the next 10 minutes or so as we explore the changes made to the 1D&D Sorcerer, the ups, the downs, and why, for the love of all that is good, Sorcery Incarnate works the way that it does. The flavor and lore of the 5e Sorcerer has always been something that has really appealed to me. This concept of a magic user with such immense and innate magical powers roiling away inside them that they are learning to control, harness, and channel is a fantasy that I think many are drawn to. It's with this background in mind that I think it's important to consider the changes made to the class in this Unearthed Arcana. In their latest video discussing the UA, Jeremy Crawford and Todd Kenrick explained that they felt that the narrative identity surrounding the sorcerer is strong and well established. However, the mechanical identity was lacking. In large part, this is because sorcerers, like a few other classes, pick their subclass at first level. What this effectively does is supplant the entire class identity onto the subclass rather than the main class. It loses its foundational building blocks in favor of what each option can provide. This is a sentiment that I do largely agree with. Picking a subclass right from the get-go means that you never truly learn what it means to be part of that class, but rather you learn how it feels to be part of the subclass. This justification for pushing back the subclass choice to 3rd level, as we've seen with every 1D&D class so far, is something that I am fully in support of. However, when we take a look at some of the proposed changes, it becomes increasingly more confusing what the team had in mind. Though they stated that they wanted to provide greater mechanical nuance to the class, they instead filled it with features that function more like supporting flavor than anything else, and opted to make many of those features simple spells rather than anything innate and inherent to the class itself, which, in my view, struggles to make the case that this class has any mechanical identity of its own when its core functionalities are spells. At first level, sorcerers gain access to spellcasting, which functions fundamentally the same as it did in 5th edition, though worth mentioning is that the class now tops out at 22 spells rather than 15, which is a nice touch, especially as many of those extra known spells come during the early levels of play. However, it's also at first level where sorcerers gain another feature, Innate Sorcery, which just gives you 2 spells that you always have prepared, Sorcerous Burst and Chaos Bolt. Interestingly, it doesn't specifically mention that these spells don't count against the spells that you can prepare. However, I would have to assume that they don't, given that in the spellcasting feature suggestion, it doesn't list either of them there. What's weird to me here is that while not always, extra prepared spells are typically something that is the domain of a subclass rather than the main class, but when it is part of the main class, it tends to come along with some additional benefit. For example, a Bard's Magical Secrets feature is essentially just learning spells. However, it lets you choose from a selection of spells that you wouldn't otherwise be able to choose from. Paladins gaining the Faithful Steed feature allows them to cast the Find Steed spell as an action rather than it taking 10 minutes, and they can do so without expending a spell slot. So then you might be thinking, well, this is a first level feature, so coming with an additional benefit wouldn't make too much sense. Well, the Ranger's revised Favored Enemy feature gives them access to Hunter's Mark without accounting against the spells prepared, and allows the Ranger to ignore the concentration requirement of the spell. Innate Sorcery instead grants 2 mediocre spells with no immediately discernible additional benefit, though I'll get to Draconic Exhalation later. This is a trend which only seems to continue. At 5th level, sorcerers gain the Sorcerer's Vitality feature, which allows them to always have the Sorcerer's Vitality spell prepared. Again, no mention of it not counting against prepared spells, but I'll just assume that this is down to poor editing and that it doesn't actually count. Sorcerer's Vitality is a 3rd level sorcerer exclusive spell that allows the user to heal themselves for an amount of hit points equal to 2d6 plus their spellcasting ability modifier and remove the blinded, deafened, and poison condition. The spell is fine, I guess, but probably underwhelming. It feels somewhat akin to Fighter's Second Wind feature, although distinctly it costs a spell slot rather than being usable an amount of times per long or short rest, and doesn't feel particularly sorcerer-y. All of this leads up to the new 9th level feature, Sorcery Incarnate. Such an incredible name for such a lackluster feature. Again, this feature merely grants you access to the Sorcery Incarnate spell, which is always prepared. This is a 5th level bonus action spell which requires concentration up to 1 minute. When cast, you regain 1d4 sorcery points, and for the duration of the spell, you can use 2 Metamagic options rather than 1, and you have advantage on attack rolls of every spell that you cast. I'm not even sure where to begin here. This feature was touted as the sorcerer almost transforming into magical energy itself, entering their ultimate form, and I really don't see it doing any of that. Firstly, since it's a spell, it can simply be countered. A core class feature representing that entity embodying the arcane and transforming into the essence of magical energy itself can be outdone by a simple 3rd level spell, and that just kind of feels disappointing. Not to mention that it consumes the sorcerer's only 5th level spell slot at the time of gaining this feature. Secondly, the benefit of having advantage on the attack rolls of spells is something which effectively relegates the sorcerer to cantrips once this has been cast, as those are the vast majority of spells that require attack rolls, and since this quote-unquote feature is a leveled spell cast as a bonus action, you can only cast a cantrip with it on the same turn anyway. Thirdly, why does this require concentration? I mean, I can understand thematically why it does, so maybe if the power level were more justified by the opportunity cost, I could get behind it. Finally, replenishing 1d4 sorcery points is just underwhelming and unreliable, but being able to use 2 metamagic options is pretty neat though. There are just so many ways to improve this. Removing concentration, granting disadvantage on spell saves, instead of replenishing sorcery points, maybe provide a 1 point cost reduction to any metamagic options used, or even any combination of these, and I am sure there are so many more suggestions. The idea behind this spell/feature is actually really cool, but the execution just leaves me perplexed. Before I go on to discuss the rest of the class, I do want to make a few points regarding the class features being turned into spells. I want to be clear that I'm not necessarily against it, as there are a number of positives to doing it this way. Firstly, and probably most obviously, it is likely to be easier for new players. There's now no separate resource to keep track of, uses per long rest or short rest, etc., and it just functions like every other part of the class does, using spell slots. It also helps to keep the unifying theme of the class alive. These are magic users that are fueled by their primary resource, those being spell slots, so therefore it makes sense that the classes in the mage group should have a reliance on spellcasting. It can also help, to some small degree at least, alleviate the martial/caster divide by acting as something of a resource sink for spellcasters. They are essentially being forced to use more of their spell slots than they otherwise would have to, just to be able to use their core class mechanics. I'm not saying that this is necessarily achieved by this change, but it's worth mentioning. However, and on the other hand, to me, it makes it so the features don't really feel like features at all, since they're really just mandatory spells. They don't feel particularly powerful, in fact in most cases they seem weaker, and they just don't have that same kind of allure. The other obvious issue it creates is that your core class mechanics, your mechanical identity, can be completely neutralized by the simple use of counterspell, and I'm just not sure how I feel about that. Though I can see how it makes sense. You're a spellcaster, your magic should be no different than any other magic, but shouldn't it? It also creates this strange situation where it's confusing as to why some things are spells and others aren't. Where is that line being drawn? Is this something that's going to be unique to the mage group, or will other casters also be getting the same treatment? I'm really not sure how I feel about this whole thing. My gut says that I hate it, but the logic of it is at least somewhat sound, so let me know what you think about it in the comments. One final note about this is that it seems like the sorcerer subclasses will provide ways of augmenting your features/spells. For example, the Draconic Sorcery subclass's 10th level feature, Draconic Exhalation, allows you to cast your Sorcerer's Burst cantrip in a 15-foot cone, and their 14th level feature, Dragon Wings, gives you additional bonuses while you're in your Sorcery Incarnate form, albeit maybe not very good ones. I can see this being a trend that does continue with, for example, Divine Soul Sorcerers being able to augment the Sorcerer's Vitality feature and probably have some additional bonuses to being in the Incarnate form as well. Though this is still something which could be accomplished if the features weren't spells, such as how the new Paladin auras work. So with all that out of the way, let's just move on to the rest of the class. Font of Magic is functionally the same, except that it now provides a minimum sorcerer level that you must be before you can convert sorcery points into a spell slot of the requisite level. Metamagic has received some tweaks, notably arriving one level earlier at 2nd level rather than 3rd, and nearly every option has received some minor improvements or clarifications to make them a bit better or easier to use, with the one big exception being Twin Spell. Twin Spell was definitely among the best and most used metamagic options in 5e, and to be honest, it was probably too good. In order to rein in its power, it had the stipulation that it could only be used on spells capable of targeting exactly one creature, but it was still a very good option. The One D&D version of Twin Spell makes it feel much more like chaining spells than twinning them. The revised version allows you to repeat the casting of a spell you used on the previous turn without the need to expend a spell slot on it in exchange for an amount of sorcery points equal to the spell's level. This is honestly a really cool metamagic option, and I would love to see it stick around, but it simply isn't what Twin Spell set out to accomplish. The design team clearly felt that the 5e implementation of Twin Spell was too powerful. They even incorporated a design note saying as much, and I can certainly see why they felt that way. However, I don't feel that this version is a faithful successor. I would rather that they either find a way to keep the essence of Twin Spell intact, albeit toned down, or rename this option to Chain Spell to leave the possibility of reviving Twin Spell in the future. At 15th level, Sorceress Restoration simply feels like it comes way too late. Yes, it's 5 levels earlier than in 5e, but it still feels 5 to 7 levels too late. The 18th level capstone, Arcane Apotheosis, to me embodies what a capstone feature should feel like. It's a feature that when you read it, it kind of makes you think, is this for real? The question of whether it's good or not is almost moot when you consider that virtually every other class capstone is just the ability to restore some resource when rolling initiative, and that Hexmaster even exists. It's interesting and built around Wish, so what's not to love? Being able to cast Wish without concern of never being able to cast it again, and being able to replicate any spell without using your 9th level spell slot, but rather the slot of the spell that you are replicating is just really cool. It fulfills for me the fantasy of what being Magic Incarnate should actually feel like. The design team has certainly taken the Sorcerer down a different design, and it's one that, while it confuses me, I don't know that I'm entirely opposed to. Though I wish that they would almost just fully commit and build the class entirely around sorcery points and do away with spell slots, and employ a system that grants many more of them and a more dynamic exchange system between using them for spellcasting and metamagics. Ultimately though, this isn't what we have. I strongly feel as though the design team never really expected this version to actually reach publication, but rather they're simply pushing out a few different ideas to see what direction that we want to take the class. As of right now, especially since wizards also have the ability to change and augment their spells, and they have access to the same spell list, it feels like there's no real reason to be a sorcerer. I'm very curious to see what direction though that this class takes over the course of playtesting. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing as it significantly helps other people find my content. Check out some of my other 1D&D videos as well, they're all linked on screen, but otherwise, take care.